during the first session, you may notice we got a lot more questions on Mentimeter than we had the time to answer. So what we are going to do is, during the conference, we're going to collate all of the questions through all of the slides for all of the speakers. And at the end of the conference, we will send those questions that went unanswered through Mentimeter to the individual speakers, and we'll allow those speakers to answer those questions in their own time and send them back. And then we will email around a delegate pack afterwards to make sure that every single question gets answered, okay? And I'm now going to hand across to Karina and Nathan.
Hi, good morning. Hi, good morning. My name is Nate Schwagler, and I am certainly the least important person up here this morning. So with that, this is going to be the easiest panel discussion chair position I've ever had, because you have great questions, I'm sure, already for both Phil and Ben Zweibelson. So I think we should just pick up where we left off. Who would like Phil to expand further on something that he mentioned this morning, or who would like Ben's interpretation or a twist on something? Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your... Oh, I'm sorry. Are you pointing at me? Okay, great. Maybe it was the bald guy behind me, sorry. Hi, thank you so much for your talk this morning, Phil. I mean, very, very insightful and enjoyable. So I work with the Canadian Department of National Defence. I joked, I had my own kind of little personal joke at your comment of how many design thinkers you have in your organization. I'm actually the one person doing ideation for our $1.2 billion innovation program called Ideas. And I've actually only been there a year. I've been with the organization for 15 years as a defense scientist.
You must be very
wealthy. Yeah, no, none of that gets channeled anywhere that I might benefit. But I think the interesting question I had in relation to what you talked about was the notion between short-term and long-term kind of thinking. And so one of the issues, of course, is, we get a great many challenges that often relate to a prescribed, a solution or a limited set of solutions. Very often people come to us, they initially thought of us as simply a procurement arm, where we could simply fund the solutions that they had already identified. Right. So obviously quite a bit of transformation that's needed there in terms of, an understanding of what constitutes innovation. But then there's this notion of kind of a tendency towards kind of incremental innovation or problems associated with kind of short-term solutions, gradual improvements in quality and value, kind of a gentle continuation in the way we already do things. And I guess the difficulty that I'm having is not simply this initial piece in terms of getting people to see their challenge statement as a starting place for something that you might seek to validate, as you put it, but then to think about how we move the organization towards an understanding of the things they hadn't even considered. So I guess that's a long-winded question in relation, well, perhaps in relation to a number of things, but I guess, can you talk a little bit about whether you bring in other methodologies around strategic foresight, alternative futures, or how you get people thinking beyond their current day issues in order to kind of frame and identify the challenges in the next, you were talking a very short time period. I mean, in militaries, obviously, we have to think much more long term, but could be 5 to 10, 10 to 30 years, something like that.
Yeah. So, there's no one answer to it all, but let me go a little bit deeper into kind of how we think. So first of all, we've missed more trends over the last 15 years by not focusing on users than anything else. If you focus on your users, because the people you're serving are out in the world and they're seeing things, you exponentially increase your understanding of the world by developing these relationships with the people in the world. So that's just a kind of writ large, we are seeing more greenfield opportunity by pivoting to this approach of engaging with our clients and the users at our clients than we've probably seen in a long time, 20, 30, 40 years. But there are some intentional things that we also do. I talked about hills, and they kind of get less and less tactical. Number one, I talked about hills. Hills, when we actually start moving through the very front end of any engagement, and by the way, this engagement might be a brand new thing, or it may be dropping this approach into something that's been going on for 50, 60 years. at IBM. So for example, we've dropped this in successfully into our mainframe software innovation, which is in Hursley, England, is still the home of our mainframe software. It has been that way since the late 1960s. It's the oldest software on the planet that is still running some of the most critical systems on the planet. And they're now using this approach. When we start ideating around what are the possibilities, there's a couple of frames that we put in. As we start narrowing in on possibilities, we tend to think about things in our language of cupcakes, birthday cakes, and wedding cakes. You typically find, especially procurement projects, especially big projects, people are always all about the wedding cake, right? So people are always looking out way longer than you imagine. And so the first framework we bring into our design thinking approach is wedding cake, wedding cake, wedding cake, and then start birthday cake, and then finally what we're going to deliver tactically in the near term is a cupcake. Now the interesting thing about a cupcake, I don't want to take this analogy too far, but the interesting thing about a cupcake is it's not a slice of cake. It is a whole experience. It's just smaller. And it's on a path to doing something bigger. So we have this notion. And then once we deliver something, and then a team is always, then the hill statement is always around the cupcake. Once you deliver the hill, a hill is something you can deliver in 3 to 6 months. And once you deliver that, it goes into your backlog and you create a new hill. So I guess what I'm framing there is that we now have got a constant process where new hills are coming in. And hills are not incremental. Hills are new value. They're new triggers to be implemented into the world. And there's now a sequence rotation of hills. And so this is now getting us into and I say 6 months, a hill is a 6 to 12 month statement. So we're now moving from, okay, we've got agile teams working on hills tactically. We're now we have a constant rotation of hills that are coming in and out that's now extended the purview of this team based on user research 12 to 18 months out. And then beyond that, yes, we do bring in provocations for incubators. In fact, the example I showed you up here, which was the material scientist example, that was actually an incubator that was put in place to start envisioning how material science will change in the world of AI 24 to 48 months out. And then, so we layer that on top. And then the final thing we do is we will bring in typically outside people. Although IBM Research, we happen to have an IBM Research facility, and they're kind of by definition, they're working at time frames of 4 to 20 years out. So today's session doesn't, by any chance, have a long enough time to tell you exactly how we integrate these concepts, but that's kind of that's the scaffolding under how we have institutionalized a 10 to 20 year view out for any market space that we enter.
Ben, maybe you want to offer some perspective on sort of challenges and inherent challenges of thinking about military organizations and getting away from the incrementalism that they're so comfortable and familiar with versus, I know you've done a lot of work with future operating concepts, for example.
Sure. So going back to your question earlier about scenario planning, strategic foresight, that's really useful for militaries, but at the same time it's also very frustrating because when you think about the industrialized West and virtually every single military today, they have their own planning methodology. And that planning methodology, most of you are very familiar with these, depending on what nation you hail from. But it starts with a desired future, a desired end state. And then from that, we reverse engineer with lines of effort, centers of gravity. There's a lot of Newtonian physics and engineering and mathematics that are applied to this in a convergent reductionist approach, of which we develop courses of action, and then we converge onto one. And then we validate it through a war game, and then we establish that plan. And when you think about scenario planning or strategic foresight, it's completely the opposite. It's refreshing, but at the same time, if you ask a military to try to do this, it's automatically very frustrating for them because all the language, all of the doctrine, all of the planning methodology, the traditional structures don't let you do that. It wants you to converge down. And what scenario planning really does brilliantly, and what design, particularly in the civilian world, and in some pockets, in various militaries and various think tanks and other government agencies are and have been experimenting with it, is you have to develop multiple futures. And some of them must be radical, disruptive, challenging, and frustrating to that organization because it's not going to be that single end state. And in fact, if you focus towards that one, you may end up in chaos. You may end up in an absolutely inappropriate or radically dangerous future of which you're not prepared for. And if we think about every company that has catastrophically failed, I love to use Blockbuster, but we have an international audience. Who here had a Blockbuster card in their wallet? Right? Okay? In 2005, they were at their largest, and they had the opportunity to buy Netflix for $50 million. And Netflix was actually in the red and almost bankrupt. And they were going to Blockbuster saying, look, we need a shot here. We need an injection of capital. Will you take a risk on us? And Blockbuster didn't, because they didn't identify and appreciate, and it goes back to Phil's speech this morning, they weren't seeing themselves in that way. They didn't see that as a viable future. They had other futures that they were focused on. So scenario planning is really important about challenging your organization. You must maintain multiple futures and work on them and work with the sponsors and continue to engage with them. It's not about reducing. It's actually about diverging and expanding and saying, that's not radical enough. We're coming back in 3 months and we're going to give you something even more shocking. And having that interface with that sponsor, so similar to the Hills and those engagements and feedbacks, and then having those discussions. What will that future be like and what could we do in there? And we've got a lot of people in the audience that are working on things such as competition right now. Action short of war, frenemies. What are we doing in politics today? Is it an act of war if somebody's doing cyber attack through social media, through third parties and trolls that you can't trace back? Right. Is that war?
Right.
And so what is that future? How do we protect against this? How do we do offensive operations? Do we call it offensive? So these are some of the challenges that don't fit into nice, neat little future end states that we can reverse engineer. And so you actually, in design, have to temporarily dismantle the planning process itself to separate that and say, we're going to do design today. And here's how that design is going to work. And you inevitably will end up with a design team that's engaging with that senior leader and that staff, while the planning team is doing something similar. And then that commander has to go back and forth between the two, of which there really isn't a lot of education today for senior leaders on how to go between the two.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, this your Blockbuster and Netflix example, and then this one that you've just talked about, is at war. I won't answer that question, but when you really start adopting this mindset and you really start thinking that it's not about the thing, it's about the user we're serving. If there is a big overlap of interest in that, you had better pay attention, because there are competing intentions for that person, even if your products are completely different. In the Blockbuster Netflix case, the fact of the matter was these were two companies trying to trigger trigger different responses, but for the same fundamental thing. That should have been seen. Had Blockbuster had this mindset, they would have seen it. And I think as we start thinking about, again, without answering a question of is it war, if there are people targeting your people and trying to get them to change their behavior, you'd better understand that and recognize that that's an intentional thing if it's not the behavior you want that populace to do. That's the real shift, and it's funny. It's the kind of thing that I tell folks it takes a millisecond to change, but it has to. It's a fundamental change in how we relate to the world. It's fundamental of not thinking about my product, but thinking about your action.
Hi, my name is Sönke Marens. I'm from Germany. I would like to challenge you a little bit, because your Hills program was only successful. Your Hills program was only successful because someone in your business said this provides more money at the end. If you couldn't bring up more money for IBM, or even if you would run IBM into bankruptcy by running Hills, there would be no Hills any longer. And that's our problem in the military. The defense challenge at the moment is on the political side. It's not on the military side. You cannot find Facebook with cannons and stuff like that. So the internal changes we are going through, we cannot put a money value like you did on. So, and therefore, if I take your assumption of money and put it in my world, it doesn't work. And this gets me the conclusion maybe Hills is not working in my world.
Well, it depends on what you're trying to get done. I would, and I don't know your specific situation or the complexities of the world. They're very different for sure. But you're assuming that Hills are all targeted towards some product outcome. You may very well have a project where you need to go alter your funding processes. That's a project that needs to be worked, and the stakeholders in that process are potentially the politicians. And what actions do they need to take, and what do you need to do to trigger those actions? So they can be applied to any objective that you want to pursue. The one thing I will say is that if you do run these things, the way that the Hills are validated, it's the only way I've ever seen that if you actually do the process, you will never go bankrupt. Because you never do anything that is not validated by real people in the real world that are your intended audience. I don't know if you would have more insight into the specifics of the vagaries of funding and all that.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'd say one other distinction, we've talked about this in previous engagements, on how do we frame out some of the differences in a security context versus a user or product experience context or industry. And so just a couple of them that we've talked about, and I'll throw them out the audience. We already mentioned one. Phil talked about monopolies. And what we really mean by that is businesses aren't allowed to be a monopoly, and actually really great leaders, really great people can move between industry easily. You could work for Goodyear one day, and then you're working for Kraft cheese the next day. If you're good at what you do, you can't do that in the military. If you are in the Navy, except for in a joint environment, you're going to be in the Navy, and you're actually very limited on your career path. And oh, by the way, it's up or out in many organizations, where if you don't make a certain grade or follow a certain timeline, you're done. If you want to become a U.S. Army Ranger, you can't take a correspondence course or go to an alternative course. You go to the United States Army Ranger School, and you graduate, or you don't. So monopolies are slightly different in that regard for the military, and it gives a great deal of control and uniformity and repetition, but at what cost? So when you have monopolies, you actually reduce the ability to think creatively and innovatively. And there's a couple other differences, one being that militaries are not-for-profit organizations. Now, we're supposed to be great stewards of our funding. Now, that's sometimes questionable in activities. But we don't go out of business, even if we're defeated. So the Iraqi army today, there is an Iraqi army. Now, a lot of the people are different, but there's still an Iraqi army, even though they were defeated. And so security organizations have to be there. One other distinction is that there's actually kind of a nice inverse between the two. The more that any business can do business, the more security there is. And so right now in Manchester, England, you have law enforcement, you have security, and so the cost of doing business is extraordinarily low for IBM. But what about the cost of doing business in Syria right now? Or somewhere else where it's an extremely volatile, dangerous. Now, you can do business there, but what are all those additional costs? Now, here's the inverse. How many of you in your military experience have done peacekeeping operations or know of peacekeeping operations? And how restricted were you in probably pretty significantly, right? But those of us that have engaged in high-intensity conflict or the beginning of an invasion, a lot more free play. And so that actually, if you imagine that, it's a difference there. And so where are we? We're not ever on the opposites, but we are operating in different areas. We have business even in high-intensity conflicts. But there's so much restriction, and we in the military, we have so much freedom versus
Interesting.
when you're having incredible freedom, we are actually restricted significantly. So these aren't opposites. It's just talking about the context. When we talk about a security context and design, and we talk about a industrial or a business or academic context and design, they all are kind of blending together. But what does the user need, and what behavior are we trying to change in what context? If you're trying to change or modify behavior in a military context, there'll be different elements versus trying to change a consumer's decision or product decision. Just a few thoughts. Oh.
So there's an old saying. Okay.
Oh, sorry. You'll be next. Sorry about that.
Is it coming?
So
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Can't hear.
Yeah, sorry.
I was just kind of tacking on with the discussion about users, and things seem unique in the military, at least from my perspective. This is a situation where there's actually a high cost of building empathy, meaning, you talk about having your core team and then you include your users, and maybe your users are 60% and your core team is 40%. In the military, depending upon, especially if you're employing design thinking tactically, your users will not likely, but there's a chance that your users will die during this cycle of planning campaigns. And so how do you work, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, how this works for, it's easier to work with personas because those aren't real people. But you talk about engaging users first before, and then you build personas later, but you're also engaging users along the way. I would imagine that, your project leads or people who are, let's say, mid-range officers, if they're doing this in a tactical setting, it's going to be quite easy that people on their product isn't going to fail. Someone may die because that is the cost of the campaign. Someone may die because a poor choice was made. So I'd just like to hear both of your perspectives of, mitigating the price of empathy if you're using users all throughout the way.
So I'll start with that. That's a great question. So one of the things that design skeptics in the military have is they have this, I believe it's a bias. And the bias is that, well, we know that planning works because it's proven. And so why would you dare risk lives with this design stuff? Because you're just going to get people killed. And I actually reject that and fight it as often as I can, in that we say that planning is founded and works, and it's proven, and it reduces risk. But I challenge to say that's not true. It's just an illusion. And really, Carl Weick is a great sociologist, and he flips the whole thing. And is the maxims normally, we remember the past so we can imagine how the future is supposed to go. And Weick says that's not really it at all. We do it the opposite. We imagine the past by creating it and giving ourselves our security blankets of what we think happened in the past so that we can remember how the future is supposed to go according to our illusion of reality. And so what Weick is really arguing there effectively is we like to say that planning reduces risk, it's proven, it's established, but I say, no, it's a methodology. It works exceptionally well in closed systems, simple systems, and complicated systems. But as Phil opened up with this morning, we are in the 21st century. We are in a complex system. And a complex system means it's learning with you. Right. As soon as you grab knowledge and information, it has learned from your grab. From you taking, it is learning and adapting, and the information that you just grabbed, it's now potentially irrelevant by your act of grabbing, which we don't like because we want that prediction. And so design is about recognizing and understanding that this system is growing and learning with you. We have to shift from a solution-based mindset, which is much more familiar for our planning, to a learning-based mindset. And that is what the essence of design is, whether you're in a civilian or a military security context. If you're not learning, if you're not reflectively practicing, you are failing. You are dying.
Yeah, I think that last point is what's key to me, is that what this is really about is adapting based on real world people that you're engaging with that are themselves adapting and having that fluidity. Yeah, I think that was great. Did that answer your question?
And one last thing to tag onto that, because to revisit this, when we do design in military context, we're on the whiteboards. So we're not necessarily killing anybody, but at the same time, just like planning results in action, design results in action. And so it's on that commander, on that leader. Properly done design is just like properly done planning. It'll be successful, but here's the catch-22. And this is what all of you that either are or are aspiring to be military designers today, this is the unfair disadvantage that you have as a designer. If you are a planner or a strategist and you have doctrine, policy, established practices, or historical precedent, you will always be insulated from being fired or destroyed, because even if you fail, you can say, boss, I followed the book.
Right.
I followed the checklist. The enemy has a vote is the excuse. But what about if you take the rules and say, we're not doing this, we're doing design, we're doing something new. We're doing something that's never been seen before, and we need new language and new concepts to describe it. And we're going to experiment with this and try something that the enemy, as well as us, we've never seen it. There's a higher risk there, and if you fail now, you have no reserve. You are exposed to be destroyed and crucified. And that's why designers can be labeled heretics, but at the same time, there is no innovation from following the rules.
This concept of risk is one that we've been working with some aspects of the military on. We started, we had different iterations of the chart that I showed and kind of used throughout my presentation of kind of narrowing in on the target, which I call the hill. And if you think about the traditional planning exercises, you to Ben's point, you've got cover because you used the process that's always been in place. But the probability of you actually hitting the mark is very wide. It's a huge curve of whether you're actually going to achieve what you intend. You might overspend and hit it. You might not deliver. But the probability of being on the mark is actually quite low. What this approach does is it doesn't say, in a given situation, 0 will die. What it does say is that the probability of hitting the target of whatever your target is much higher. Now, because you can't prove a negative, it exposes you to all of the institutional, personal risk that Ben talked about as you de-risk the project. So it's kind of another one of these things where you've got increased risk over here, less risk over here, empirically. But for some reason, but for some people, potentially taking this risk is more probable. I don't know. It's a fascinating question.
It's safer in your career, I think, to follow the rules. But at the same time,
it may be more detrimental to the people you're trying to serve.
Absolutely, and that's a great paradox.
Yeah.
And the other interesting thing is that senior leaders in the military right now, where is education provided in a career timeline for you to be innovative, to be disruptive, to be a change agent, right? If it's offered at all, it's generally offered at the war college or senior level. So we expect our people to go through a pipeline and to be educated and have experience and do things all the way through their career, and at the very end, they're going to be anointed, and now they're going to be creative and disruptive and agents of change. That really doesn't work that way, but at the same time, the people that we identify early as the divergent thinkers, the creatives, the eccentrics, how well do they normally do in convergent, centralized, hierarchical military organizations? Those of you that are laughing. All right.
Excellent, thank you.
Hi, Aaron Jackson
sorry.
from Australian Department of Defence. Yeah.
We'll get you next.
So I have a demand more than I have a question. And looking back at the past when militaries have taken business models and processes, it hasn't necessarily worked out the best for us because of a lot of the differences in context we're talking about. And as a short example, I'm thinking, a great example is I think the implementation of business management models by Robert McNamara in the US DoD in the 60s led to a lot of efficiencies and a lot of rationalities, but it also, in my view, led to a lot of the human element being removed from the way militaries manage ourselves and what it is that we do. So my demand is, I would like you both to tell me how it is that we are going to be able to take the good elements of a link between academia and private enterprise and the military and design processes, while at the same time filtering out some of the potential drawdowns and drawbacks that we might pick up along the way due to the difference of the environment in which we're going to apply this thing.
You want me to start?
Go. You've written a whole paper on this.
All right, I'll start and say, what we're at right now is, I think, destructive innovation. Militaries, by and large, have many of us either directly or indirectly experimented and participated in a series of conflicts going on even prior to 9/11. There's been a period of instability really since the fall of the Cold War. And there was a period of peacekeeping activities in the 90s, and many of our militaries kind of lost their way on what they were really doing, bringing a lot of 20th century things that were successful then, or appeared to be successful, set practices, into the 21st century where we have so many new things that are different. We have entire new domains. And I hesitate to use the term domain, but you know, for this discussion we have the cyber domain, we have the space domain now, which is really, we have the Space Force coming out. These are things that are making it even more complex. And we think about how connected we are and technology and what technology is affording. So with that, we have almost these established walls. And every wall you see around you, there's a whole slew of people within your organization that are saying, yes, we need to knock some walls down, but not this one, because this one's mine. It's tied to my relevance, and I'm successful because this wall was here, and you will not knock it down. You can knock that wall down. Oh, wait, someone's guarding that wall. So here's the thing is, you as a designer are a wrecking ball. Because in order to create, you first have to destroy. Cognitively, think about it. Any innovation that occurred generally because that innovator said, there's something in the legacy system right now that's insufficient. Or there's something that's flawed. Or there's something that's now irrelevant. And because of that irrelevance, it creates tension. And that's where that innovative opportunity becomes. That's the seed. The seed is in destruction. We must destroy to create. But there's not a lot of emphasis on destruction or failure in military culture. We don't talk about it. We talk about creating and prolonging and improving efficiencies. And we kind of dust away the ugly, messy elements of knocking walls down. And if you do have the opportunity to knock a wall down, you're under tremendous pressure because you're supposed to build a better wall instantaneously, and it better look like the old wall and sound like the old wall and have the same language and follow the doctrine just like the old wall. That's not going to work either. And so there's a huge tension within militaries, partly because of our culture, and the other part I would say is because of our security context. The demands that we're placed under that are quite difficult, particularly with political cycles, election cycles, and public demand, and the instantaneous feedback of information now directly to people's phones as it's happening on the battlefield.
Yeah, I would. I'm not diminishing not trying to diminish the differences that do exist and may exist. But I think there is something fundamental about this approach that is different from the ones that were brought in last century. There is no fundamental profit motive to what I talked about today. There is no fundamental either revenue or efficiency model to what I talked about today. The model is understand the people that you are trying to trigger a change in. And this approach will help your team align around that, and because of that alignment, the probability of you hitting the mark quicker is increased. At the end of the day, that's what this is about. If you look at, even inside IBM, if you look at our Hill statements, there's zero revenue. Nothing is about revenue. It is how are we going to get a user, and the word user is getting in the way a little bit. And I was thinking about this as I was working on the presentation. I don't know what the right word is, but because you all aren't dealing with user unless you're building a product for somebody, but if you're trying to move a stakeholder to some different point of view, you know, in my lingo, that's a user that you would be targeting, but you're trying to identify those human beings or classes of human beings, and you're trying to identify how you can better get them to do the thing you want them to do versus alternatives that they have in the world. There is no money in that statement. And this approach is built to help you do that. So I think there's opportunities, I guess is all I'm saying, in this particular approach that are different from the business approaches that were brought in, because this isn't fundamentally a business approach. It has been applied to, anyway.
I think your airline case is a fascinating example and validates this in that you could have billed the airline a lot more money had you built them a new kiosk system, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Gentleman right there.
Hi there, thank you for your patience. I'm John Carney from the UK's Defence Science and Technology Laboratory. I think there's an old saying that used to say, if you want to change the people, change the people. So I was interested in either IBM or the US military's recruitment strategy in terms of diversity. So is either organisation looking seriously at diversity, and how's it going?
We spend a ton of senior management time, so it's a huge part of not just who we recruit, but also the mentoring and career acceleration. And as I said before, we have a pretty expansive view of diversity. There's certainly a gender and racial diversity. There's cultural diversity. It's a big part of who we are. The push has, over the last 4 years, I can tell you that the amount of senior executive bandwidth that's given to this topic is significant and ongoing. And I'm sure it must be, and I actually don't know, but it must be.
I'm not an authority on this at all, but I'll tell you that in my own personal opinion, and I did an article in the U.S. Air Force Air and Space Power Journal a few years ago on reading lists, because reading lists for me it shows a little bit of behind the curtain of how senior leaders are trying to shape the force, shape younger generations. You should read these things, and then Dr. Jackson and I actually have written on that as well, on books that shouldn't be read on these reading lists. But what I found was in my research using social paradigm theory, so basically looking at different paradigms and putting the books, the authors, their intents into each of these, is there was absolutely no diversity at all in my study of the United States Army and the United States Air Force. And in fact, I was surprised as an Army guy that the Air Force was actually worse than the Army. The Army had 2 books out of about 20 that went into another paradigm a little bit. In the Air Force, all of their books for the reading list I studied were exclusively on one. And so what happens there is you have not a diversity of thinking. And militaries are really good at getting diversity of gender, of demographics, ethnic. We're even working on age. We're looking at who can serve and how. There's great opportunities with people with disabilities. All these things are great with their diversity. But look at what we're recruiting for in terms of degrees. What is the focus right now? It's STEM. It's an analytic optimization focus because that feeds right into the established professional military education system, the methodologies, the language, the structure, the ontology and epistemology of how we like to think about reality in war. And so until we can break out of that, we're going to just lose that ability to think diversely. And I'll give you one last example. When's the last time you saw or experienced postmodern concepts being introduced in professional military education or practice? Normally, you get like kind of the vampire look, like, with the garlic. That is the reaction, which is important because when we draw our claws and say, no, not that. I don't want those ideas. Think about why that is and why there's that hostility towards something because it threatens or it runs against the standard, hey, we're moving towards greater optimization, greater analytic, we're reducing risk even more. That stuff doesn't make any sense to me. Why would we even do that?
Reminds me of a design workshop we did not too long ago in a military context where one of the participants came up to me at the break and was so excited. He's like, there's great diversity in the room. And I looked around and I didn't see much to the eye. And he said, there's one person from the Navy, there's one Marine, and we also have somebody from the Air Force, right? I'm like, I guess that's diversity, right? If I could dig a little bit deeper into your experience, Phil. You had that great slide that went from red to teal, our team, sort of internal IBM design folks versus client side, right? Yep. And then you talk about diversity from sort of the couple different variations of diversity, but I'd love to know, on the slide you had organized it based off subject matter expertise as being sort of the primary criterion, right? Yep. The HR person, the process analyst, et cetera. Do you look for psychometric traits or cognitive preferences at all, or how do you, when you think about who's a great person to engage from the client side to bring into the workshop environment, knowing that they represent sort of the wild card of the soup, right? Like, yep, they're not from your team, they're not formally trained in design. You've identified them for their subject matter expertise, but who makes a great design participant from the client side?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the way it kind of, in the perfect world, and sometimes it's anybody who will actually spend time with us, but in the perfect world, so it starts with the research. It starts with field-based research. It starts with data, quant, whatever you can get a hold of, to actually form the hypotheses underpinning your personas. And then you go back out in the world and you test those personas. That in and of itself is an iterative process. Starts in the field, gathering all sorts of insights. In that situation, you want a very diverse set, as many people as you can identify. In a short project, it might be 20 or 30 different people that, roughly speaking, populate the users or the target stakeholders in this exercise. As you synthesize those, you narrow them down into these personas. The personas are what scales across your broader internal team. You obviously can't have everybody on the internal team can't interact with every single person in the world. So you've got a dedicated research function that is interacting and bringing back the generative research that forms the personas and tests them. Once the team is aligned around the personas, the heavily informed personas, and you start working on your hills, what is the differentiation? How are we going to move these people? If they have these traits, how are we probably going to move them? Once you've established your hills, and there's 3 and only 3 hills at any given point in time for a project, then is really the people that are starting to really co-create with you. And now you go back out into the real world and you try to find the most extreme example of a person who would help you take the hill. Now, the problem with finding those people in the beginning is the potential for them to take you off into a singleton space is very high. But because you've got all of this research and because you're now targeting at a hill, the fact that you have an extreme user is actually very good. Because if you satisfy the extreme user, you will, by definition, satisfy everybody else. An example, if you were thinking about a gaming app, right? If you went to I'll use some stereotypes here, but if you went to the geekiest gamer on earth and tried to understand what they wanted or needed, you would build something crazy out here, and the bulk of the world would not want it. It'd be too advanced. So kind of what you do is you get the swath of the world, you understand the swath of the world, this is what we need to move this population, this is our hypothesis about this is what we're going to do and deliver to the world. Then you go get that gamer, and you have that person help you take the hill. It's rooted in a broader understanding. So that's kind of how it works in our, and that single person, or it doesn't take many, by the way. Once you have a well-defined hill, 1 or 2 or 3 humans are all you need. It's incredible how it scales.
I can tell you, I'd rather see those 1 or 2 or 3 people than sit in 1, 2, or 3,000 more meetings.
Yeah, yeah.
That slide.
Hi, I'm Kirsty from the British Army's innovation team. The thing I'm finding the most annoying is, as you said at the beginning of your presentation, Phil, is that we're converts, or I'm a convert, and I love this stuff and it's great. And then I get placed in the innovation team in Army headquarters, and it is possibly the least innovative place that I've seen in my very few years in the Army so far anyway. But trying to get people to actually follow this process, even in our team, I'm the only one who's even vaguely researched design thinking. I've never done proper formal training on it, but I've tried to teach myself. And trying to get them to actually follow the process. They'll do it when they're in a closed classroom, and we'll have a whiteboard and sticky notes and blah, whatever. And they'll do it, but then they'll go back to their desk, and it's like, Control-Alt-Delete. Forget, just do, the boss wants a script written for something. Do you know what I mean? And you go back to this daily grind of crap that is just tedious and incredibly frustrating. And I've spent my very short career already thinking, do I stay? Do I go? Do I stay? Do I go? Because of this frustration of not really seeing proper behavior change. So do I need to do like a design thinking process of how I get them to understand design thinking? Or what do I, help me, please?
Design intervention.
Yeah. I can only tell you, now you're getting into the heart of things. I talked about the fact that there was a funding issue in the way that governments procure. The second is an organizational behavior issue, and I'll be honest, I'm ignorant about a lot of the organizational behavior in any one of your organizations, but we are beginning to do work with a couple of organizations. The Joint Special Operations Command in the U.S., NATO here, we're at the beginning of projects where we're starting to understand how we could scale out in a big way teams to actually do this. So let me start with that caveat that we are in early days of how to do this in your context, but I'll tell you how we did it. And I think it will be something along these lines, modified for the organizational peculiarities of militaries and governments. When we started our program, I was telling somebody at the break, it started, there was actually a case study that got our chairman, Jenny Rometty, when she first, literally her first month as CEO, there was a case study. She didn't know it was design, didn't know it was design thinking, didn't care. But there was a case study of the division that I had run that produced good results. And she said, whatever you did there, because she knew it was disruptive, whatever you did there, can we do it everywhere? That started our program. The first thing that we did was Jenny brought her leadership team to a one-day workshop, not unlike, and we talked about things not unlike we're talking about right now. We told them about design thinking, we gave them some examples, they dipped their toes in it. They did some post-it exercises, they did an empathy map, they started to understand, oh, it's a different point of view, blah, blah, blah. In that one day, we identified of about the 15 or so people in the room, there were about 3 or 4 that said they would sponsor projects. And this is the first thing I would say. Teaching design thinking as a course generically, I haven't had much success with. You have to have a team that chooses to do it, and then they have to live through the process. But it's hard to do that without some overarching remit for the very reason you say. They'll come to a workshop, but they won't actually live it. Well, we turn the tables around by having our very, so this is essentially, our 4 stars and 3 stars, and 3 of them sponsored teams. So that team not only had the permission, but they also had the remit to go, your next project, you're going to do in this way. So that was the first thing we did, is we created a linkage between the very senior people who cared and the team. And when we onboarded that team, we not only started with a 1-week workshop, but we had people from my team ongoing with them. We basically embeds. We embedded with them to make sure they did it outside of the workshop. The other thing that we put in place then was for each of these, and we started with 7 teams. For each of these 7 teams, I personally had a quarterly one-on-one call with every one of the senior vice presidents and Jenny about the team. I'll say it again. It was a one-on-one call. So the team knew that I was going to be talking to Jenny and the SVP about them, and they weren't going to be on the phone. And I wasn't going to brief them with what I was going to say. Needless to say, that engendered certain behaviors on the part of that team. And when I talked to those folks, I didn't talk about the work that they were doing because they were seeing the artifacts. Those conversations were 100% about the culture of the team. And who were the assholes on the team that weren't doing it. And there were changes made over the course of that. And that was about the first 9 months of the program. All we focused on were those 7 teams. We used design thinking, but we never taught design thinking. We just brought these practices to those teams, and they realized that these practices helped them achieve their goal faster. So that was really how we did it. And my opinion is that without something like that, and then, as I said earlier, we added later that for each team that came into the program, we would do a one-day shop with the line management all the way up to Jenny. But it's why I tell people that the real key to the early success of the program, the real key wasn't that we did design thinking down here, it's that I had a communications program up here. And it was a lightweight. It was a 15 to 20 minute call once a quarter. But it was one-on-one and it was real. And there were no holds barred. And I feel like something like that has got to be put in place. Somebody at the top has got to be championing this and driving it. If you don't have that, it will never work.
Ben, do you want to build on that? Maybe
I
2 minutes?
think we're are we good on time or 2 minutes left? 2 minutes left, okay. Right, absolutely. This is one of those challenges that many of us have already experienced for a long time within various militaries. How do we get a champion? How do we get, because we are a centralized hierarchy. As much as we don't like it, if a general officer or general officers don't want design, if they don't want innovation. Now, innovation labs and innovation cells are popping up everywhere. It is probably the most popular cliche right now, aside from machine learning and AI augmentation, which is the new shiny objects. And so with that, okay, you got an innovation lab. Who are we going to put in there? Well, guess what militaries do? They just assign people. Right. Generally planners, which is a problem because planners are normally really good at planning. And I'm a recovering planner. We're not really tailored, geared towards innovation. And so if you don't put people in there that have innovation background or innovation education, then you got to get it for them. But if the senior leader, if that champion, that sponsor, doesn't empower that organization to have the exact things that Phil's talking about, that if that's not going to happen, then we're just finger drilling it.
Yep.
We're just finger drilling it again. And so what I would say is the best opportunity for an organization is you have to be really good at planning. Because I know I've kind of beat up on planning this whole time, but honestly, it's very useful and very important. We have to be good at planning. But we have to, in addition to being really good at planning, we have to create those pockets of innovation, of creativity, of divergent thinking, of challenge and disruption. And that change agent, that senior leader, is a gardener. And they are moving between the two gardens. They are moving from the standardized, structured, efficiency-based garden, which we have to grow because that's our lifeblood. That keeps people alive, it gets things done. But then they're going over to the experimental side. They're trying and testing and grooming and doing different things that seem almost crazy. The British Air Force in the interwar period did some crazy stuff where they stripped all the controls, all the labels off of some of their airplanes because these airplanes were coming out. The engineers were making them faster than the military could learn how to use them. And so the British Air Force said, you know what we're going to do? The Royal Air Force, we're going to take everyone fly the planes, but that one plane over there, strip all the labels off it. Throw the book out. And when you go up in it, I want you to try different things. Because even the engineers don't really know what's going on with this plane. We want you to test it, push it to its limits. And that sounds crazy, but think about that. That is somebody creating their organization, the willingness to experiment, to try something different, because guess what? One of those combinations of levers and pedals that the engineers didn't even plan for allows the plane to do something that even the designers didn't think they could do, which gives them an opportunity against the enemy in the air. And the plane is now going to behave in a way that the enemy had never seen before, potentially giving an incredible advantage to that pilot, but could never have been discovered unless you stripped all the labels and dials and allowed them to do that innovation, that creativity, which is at a greater risk. And so the senior leader must be that constant gardener, willing to grow things as the way they're supposed to, but also having the mad scientist lab. Without both, we're not going to have innovation. We'll just have a label that says innovation here.
All right, folks, if you didn't get a chance to ask either Phil or Ben, hound them during the coffee break. They'll do their best, I'm sure, to answer. But please join me in thanking the
Thank you.
Thank you.